What if there's a particular book of the Bible that was specifically written for you? Chances are there is, and that's what we're going to look at on today's installment of Authentic. We're right in the middle of a series on the four gospel accounts, the four eyewitness accounts of the life and teachings of Jesus. Who wrote them, why they wrote them, and why they're so important. So if you're joining us for the first time, you might want to go to the website, voiceofprophecy.com, and click on the Show tab for Authentic, and look for the first 3 episodes. Of course, I think we're also available on a variety of podcast platforms, so there's a pretty good chance you can find the previous episodes on one of those as well. Now, today we're moving on to the Gospel of Luke, which is everybody's favorite gospel during the Christmas season because it provides the most detail when it comes to the birth of Christ. Millions of people know parts of Luke's gospel by heart, whether they know it or not, because of its seasonal prominence. I'm thinking of passages like these famous lines from Luke chapter 2. I'll read them to you from the Old King James Version because that's the version most of you are going to recognize. It says, "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed." So, of course, that's the reason that Joseph and Mary were in Bethlehem the night that Christ was born, because in order to comply with the census, everybody had to report to their ancestral hometown. Historically, the need to go home probably wasn't a Roman idea, because the Romans tended to create census data based on the place you currently lived, the way we do it now. And in some parts of the empire, like up to the north among the barbarians, they simply listed people by their tribes, which made pretty good sense because the Germanic tribes were often on the move. But among the Jews, the idea of ancestral land was so important that Herod probably thought that doing the census in your family's hometown, rather than the place you currently lived, made really good sense. But now, of course, I'm wandering off course just a little bit, so let's get back to the Gospel according to Luke. The first few chapters are easily some of the best recognized passages from the Bible because of their popularity at Christmas. But they might just be well known for another important reason. When we looked at Matthew's Gospel, we saw that he was creating an account of Jesus for people of a Jewish background, and he was emphasizing that Jesus was the legal son of David, the King of the Jews. And so the first Gospel has come to be associated with a lion, specifically the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Then we saw that Mark was writing for unbelievers and focused largely on the acts of Christ, the things that Jesus did, in an attempt to persuade people to consider Jesus' claims. Historically, the church has often identified Mark's gospel with the figure of an ox, because it shows Jesus, the patient servant, who came to work for the broken human race. So today we come to Luke, a book that was written by a Gentile for a Gentile audience. And it emphasizes Jesus as the Son of Man, the member of the Godhead who condescended to become a real flesh and blood human being. This is why the genealogy in Luke chapter 3 is different from the one in Matthew chapter 1. Matthew was tracing Jesus back to the illustrious King David through Joseph, through his adopted father, to establish that Jesus was indeed a legal heir to the royal family. But Luke traces the family line through Mary, and you'll notice he goes all the way back to Adam, who is said to be the Son of God. And the reason for that is to prove that Jesus is fully human, the Son of Man, a genuine member of the human race. And so the historical symbol for this gospel naturally was a man. So, what we have so far in the Gospels is a lion, an ox, and a man, which are 3 of the 4 faces on the cherubim that you find in Ezekiel chapter 1 and Revelation chapter 4. When we finally get to John's Gospel, you can easily guess what the symbol is going to be, because the 4th face of the cherubim was an eagle. So, in antiquity, each of the 4 Gospels was thought to be one of the 4 faces of the cherubim. which I think we discussed at some length in the first part of this series. Now, let's zero in on the Gospel of Luke. And maybe the first thing we should do is simply identify the author. Luke is not a Hebrew name, and that's because Luke was not a Jew. He was a doctor who came from the city of Antioch, a key center of influence for the burgeoning Christian movement of the first century. In fact, Antioch was the first place that believers in Jesus were called Christians, even though the word was originally meant to be an insult. It was disparaging. And Luke was one of those Christians, a Gentile who accepted that Jesus was God in human flesh. And of course, that was a rather difficult proposition for most Gentiles to accept because it was really hard for the Hellenistic or the Greek mind to believe that a God would lower himself to assume a purely physical existence. Because physical existence, the Greeks believed, was far less than perfect. In fact, many Gentile philosophers believed that the one who made this physical world we live in couldn't possibly be the supreme being. As far as they were concerned, it must have been the work of a lesser God of some kind, because the Almighty God would simply never lower himself to the level of this material world. So, in other words, Dr. Luke had his work cut out for him, because if he was going to persuade Gentiles that God had come in human flesh, well, that was going to take a lot of convincing. And so we find him anchoring the genealogy of Jesus in the very roots of the human race, all the way back to Adam. And throughout this gospel, Jesus is referred to not so much as the Son of God, but as the Son of Man. In fact, in Luke's gospel, if I'm remembering this right, we see Jesus referring to himself as the Son of Man more often than he does in Matthew, Mark, or John. Now, we probably have a break coming up in just a few minutes, so let me quickly just deal with one other interesting aspect of Luke's gospel. You'll notice at the very beginning that it's addressed to a man by the name of Theophilus. Here's the way that it reads right at the very top of the book. It says, "Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed." Notice that Luke was writing an orderly account. And this gospel isn't the only place he does that. He also wrote the book of Acts, which was also addressed to this guy, Theophilus. And that book begins like this over in Acts chapter 1. It says, "The former account I made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began to both do and teach." So what you have is one account really spread across two different books. In the first book, Luke records the life and teachings of Christ. And in the second book, he describes the birth of the Christian church and its rapid spread all over the Roman Empire. Both of these books were addressed to a guy named Theophilus, which makes you wonder who in the world he was. His name literally means friend of God, which makes some people think that it was just a generic term that Luke was using for all Gentiles who were friendly to the Hebrew faith. That would make Theophilus, well, a symbol, a general name for all of us. But honestly, I kind of doubt that interpretation, because the way Luke talks about Theophilus suggests that he was a real person, a single individual. And if that's true, you've got to wonder who in the world he was. I'll be right back after the break to see if we can figure that out.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
The Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts are both addressed to a man named Theophilus, which is Greek for friend of God. Some people think it's a generic term, a personification of all Gentiles, people like you and me. But it's also possible that Theophilus was a real person. And there's actually a compelling reason that Luke might send what he calls an orderly account to this single individual. When you get to the book of Acts, You'll notice that even though the first part focuses on Peter, the bulk of Acts really focuses on Paul, who was the missionary to the Gentile world. And you'll notice it really doesn't say much about the other disciples. We know historically that Thomas went to India, and Andrew went to the British Isles, and so on. But none of that is recorded in the book of Acts. We get a little bit from the life of Philip and some more about the lives of Peter and John, but then it's really all about Paul, which makes good sense because the book of Luke is aimed at Gentiles, and Paul was the guy who took the story of Jesus out to the Gentile world. And Luke was actually with him for quite a bit of that. But then we also know that Paul was eventually arrested and sent to the city of Rome to be put on trial. In fact, Paul was arrested more than once, first in Caesarea and then later in Rome. So what some people think is that Theophilus was some kind of high-ranking officer. After all, Luke calls him most excellent, and that he was somehow involved with the trial of Paul. In fact, some people have speculated that he may have even been Paul's lawyer, and he needed some facts about Paul's life in order to build his case, details about Paul's work, his beliefs, his involvement in various scandals. You know, the kind of stuff a lawyer would need to make the case that Paul was not a threat to the Roman Empire. That would explain why Paul's personal testimony appears 3 times in the book of Acts. And it would also explain why Roman characters seem to be portrayed in a mostly positive light all throughout Luke's writings. I mean, there'd be no point in poking the Roman bear if you're trying to convince the Romans that Paul is innocent. Let me show you what I mean. In the 23rd chapter of Luke, you suddenly have the testimony of a Roman centurion who was there the moment Jesus died, and he says, certainly, this was a righteous man. That's a good report about a Roman. We also see Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, declaring Jesus to be innocent 3 times. Now, can I prove that the book of Acts is some kind of legal brief? No, I can't. All we have is circumstantial evidence. But the theory does make a lot of sense when you read the books carefully. And the fact that the book of Acts suddenly ends with Paul in prison, and it doesn't tell us what happened to him after that, well, certainly makes it seem more likely. This was written before Paul was executed, so it's entirely possible that it was prepared for his trial, and in the process, it created an inspired record of Christian history that survives to this day. Now, if you think about it, that would mean it's not just Paul on trial in these documents, it's also the entire Christian faith. Luke is daring to tell the Gentiles that God had come in human flesh, and he works very hard to make the case. You'll notice that back in Matthew's Gospel, the birth of Christ doesn't receive nearly the amount of attention that Luke gives it. Luke really zeroes in on the humanity of Christ. He was born to a real mother, just like you and me. He was born in very humble circumstances in the presence of mere animals. He was laid in a manger and wrapped in swaddling clothes. The Jesus Luke describes is very relatable, and it's easily the most human account of his ministry. And what Luke is trying to do is portray Jesus as the Savior of the whole world and not just the Jews. And that becomes really obvious in some of the little details you find throughout the book. Take, for example, the parable of the fig tree that Jesus tells in Matthew 24. Let me read just a little bit of that to you, because there's a tiny little difference between Matthew's version and the one that Luke tells. Jesus is talking about the signs of his coming, and this is what he says. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, know that it is near, at the doors. What he's telling us is that we can know when his return is close by reading the signs. The same way that new leaves in spring remind us that summer is certainly going to arrive. We might not be able to predict the day or hour, but we can know when it's close. And you'll notice, Jesus uses a fig tree to make that point, which Jesus sometimes used as a special symbol for Israel. In another parable, he talked about a fig tree that failed to bear fruit, and he was clearly talking about the covenant people. But then take a look at Luke's version, and I want you to notice the difference. Luke records it like this. Then he spoke to them in a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they are already budding, you see and know for yourselves that summer is near. Now, did you catch it? Matthew only mentioned a fig tree, but Luke adds, all the trees in his version of the same story. Why? Well, because he wasn't writing to a Jewish audience, and he was careful to emphasize that the gospel is meant for everybody, whether Jew or Gentile. Luke is showing us a very relatable God, the Creator who became one of us. He lived among us, laughed with us, cried with us, suffered with us, and was moved by compassion when he saw our suffering. He was so humble that the lowest of people could relate to him. His very lowly birth was first announced to shepherds, who were considered the bottom of the social order. Shepherds were lowlifes in those days, people who watched sheep because they couldn't do anything better. And yet the angels approached them first. Why? Because the Son of God had become just like all of us, not like the king who sat in a palace just a few miles from Bethlehem, not like a member of the Sanhedrin, a high-ranking member of society, but like us. Everyday, normal people with battered and broken lives. The book of Hebrews reminds us, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin." What Luke describes is an authentic human experience. The life of Christ shows us what humanity was supposed to be like before we broke away from our Creator. You and I were made in the image of God, the Bible teaches, made to reflect His perfect character, and we threw it all away in pursuit of self-sufficiency. But instead of getting rid of us, God did the unthinkable. He became one of us. And with Jesus, we see what human beings are supposed to be like. We see the real deal, another Adam, except this time the perfect man is living in an imperfect world, the world that you and I live in. Christian writer A.W. Pink points out that there's an interesting detail in the way Luke talks about the temptations of Christ. Matthew arranges the temptations so they build to a natural climax, ending with the devil offering Jesus all the kingdoms of this world. But you'll notice that Luke's order is different. He lists the temptations in chronological order. The temptation to turn stones into bread, the offer of the kingdoms of the world, and then the devil dares Jesus to leap from the pinnacle of the temple. And when he does that, Luke is approximating the order of the temptations that you find in the Garden of Eden, from an appeal to our appetite to the appeal to become something more than God intended us to be. It's almost as if Luke is underlining the fact that Jesus, the last Adam, is succeeding where the first Adam failed. All right, it's time to take another quick break, but when I come back, we'll dig just a little more deeply into the Gospel of Luke.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
You find a number of parables in Luke's Gospel that the other Gospel writers leave out, and they're pretty telling. It shows us what Luke is driving at. For example, the story of the Good Samaritan is only found in Luke, and it's the story of a Gentile who behaves better than a priest and a Levite, members of the covenant community. The Samaritans were considered as unclean by the Jews, just like the rest of the Gentile world. Outsiders who had settled in the region of Samaria and had adopted a form of Judaism that the Jews found completely unacceptable. The last thing any Jew wanted to do was walk through Samaritan territory. They'd be ritually defiled, they said. And so they usually took the long way around in order to prevent that. Yet in the parable, it was an unclean Samaritan who best demonstrated the love of God. And it's an appeal to Luke's Gentile audience. But it really runs a little deeper than that. The Samaritan helped a man who couldn't help himself, a victim who had been ruthlessly beaten and robbed of his possessions. And in a way, the victim represents us, the entire human race. A liar and a thief, according to Jesus, had assaulted the human race and left us completely destitute and unable to help ourselves. So along comes Christ, a member of the Godhead who condescended to our level of existence in order to save us. He found us on the road and He bandaged our wounds. In Luke chapter 4, Jesus tells us exactly what He came to do. Listen to this story. Luke 4. And He was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when He had opened the book, He found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of the sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." You'll notice, by the way, that Luke mentions that Jesus had to look that passage up in the Bible just the same way that you and I would have to. The Good Samaritan in this parable is Jesus, the one who came to bandage us and pay all our expenses. You'll notice in the parable that the Samaritan opens an account with the innkeeper and says, "Look, this is all on me. And my expenses are being handled by the Son of God." Paul writes in his letter to the Colossians that Jesus has wiped out my debt, the handwriting of requirements that was against us. And Jesus nailed that to His cross. He paid my debt because, well, there's no way I can pay it. And of course, this is exactly the right story to share with the Gentile world. Luke was an educated man who wrote in high-class Greek, and he was speaking to people with a Greek perspective on the universe. The physical world was kind of dirty to them, something to be shunned, something you long to get away from. And for a Greek philosopher, it would seem, well, illogical that a pure God would enter this material world. But in the story of the Good Samaritan, Luke shows his audience why Jesus did it. Not only does he emphasize the God-given love to be found in Gentile hearts, but he shows us how a man with an ignoble reputation came to lead us out of our moral mess. This is the reason that God became a man, to pay our way back to health. All right, I have to take one more quick break, but I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. Bible prophecy can be incredibly vivid and confusing. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Our free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and our world. Study online or request them by mail and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Well, the clock in the studio assures me that I'm starting to run out of time, so let's see if we can summarize this, or at least give you enough to encourage you to read Luke in a way that maybe you've never looked at this book before. Here's what I probably like best about Luke's Gospel. It was written for Gentiles, and I happen to be one of those. I'm the descendant of Germanic barbarians. This Gospel was written for my people. I mean, yes, it was written in sophisticated Greek for the Romans and the Greeks, people who were considered to be much more educated and sophisticated than my ancestors. My people were considered somewhat less than human, living on the fringes of the empire, lurking about in dark forests and speaking an unsophisticated language. In fact, that's where the word barbarian comes from. The Greeks were making fun of the way my ancestors spoke, suggesting that it was nothing but meaningless babble, bar, 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 which is why we have the word barbarian. But today, my people, those reprehensible forest dwellers of old, are also part of the kingdom of Christ. And every December, our children also put on bathrobes and cotton swab beards to retell the story of the Incarnation, the night that God Himself became a real man. And when we tell that story, we use the words of Luke, the man who wrote the story, for us. And wouldn't you know it? It was those horrible barbarians who ended up inventing the printing press and translating this book into thousands of very common languages. It was Gentiles who eventually pulled the story of Jesus out of the ivory towers of medieval Europe and put it back where Luke intended it to be, in the homes of average, everyday people speaking simple languages. Jesus came for everybody. Luke's Gospel is the story of Jesus, the Son of Man. He was born just like we are, and He lived just like we do, and He died just like we will have to. He was an ordinary human whose parents had to register for a census, who had to pay taxes just like you. Jesus knew what it was like to be hungry or lonely or rejected just like you do. He knew what it was to be misunderstood, to be laughed at, to be persecuted without just cause, like some of you. Luke is showing us a Jesus we can really understand, and a Jesus that really understands us. The Jesus you find in Luke's Gospel was so human that we see Him eating food. 3 times Luke points out that Jesus had dinner with the Pharisees. In Luke chapter 19, we see Him hanging out in the home of a man that everybody hated, a lowly tax collector. And after the resurrection, when the disciples had some trouble believing that Jesus had actually risen from the dead, He appeared in front of them. And what did He do? He ate fish and a honeycomb in their midst, proving that even after the resurrection, He is every bit as human as you are, and that He intends to stay in human form. Jesus is God in a real physical body. Luke is demonstrating that Jesus was just like us, but thank God He was also different. His birth was different from ours because He had no earthly father. His conduct was better than ours, and He showed us what God is really like. And then He died in a way that I don't have to, because He took the sins of humanity on Himself. This is God in human flesh, all right, who came to experience what we have to live with, but He did it perfectly without ever sinning. You know, right now, there are roughly 8 billion people living on the face of this planet, and the vast majority of them are Gentiles, the very people that Luke was trying to reach. And unfortunately, right now, most of us get our impressions of what Christianity is from TV or social media, and that is not an accurate picture of God. It's actually driving people away from Christ. So, here's the challenge I want to give you. The Gospel of Luke is the human face of Christ, and the book of Acts, it's the real account of how the Christian church was born. And I'm daring you to read these books for yourself, because you're exactly the person that Luke wanted to talk to. For the Son of Man, Jesus said, has come to seek and to save that which was lost. Okay, that's it for this week, and of course we still need to look at John before we move on to other topics. Thanks for watching. I'm Shawn Boonstra, and this has been Authentic.